The golden milestone, the Malarium Aureum, was a column in the Roman Forum, in the heart of Rome and the heart of the Roman Empire. As you will have heard, all roads lead to Rome, and the Malarium Aureum was the point from which all Roman roads started and the point from which all distances were measured. As you made your way along a Roman road, you'd come across another such column or pillar, similar but more simple, staggered every 1,000 passus, or paces or steps, marking out the miles to or from Rome. Now, if you headed out of Rome on the Via Claudia until you got to the 5th milestone, and if it just so happened to be April the 25th, then you would find the area to be bustling with activity. For this was the day of the Robigalia, and this was where people were congregating in the fields outside Rome in order to celebrate it. Or perhaps celebrate is not quite the right word. The Robigalia was a festival held in honor of a deity who was feared, because this was a deity who could do harm and bring famine. This was therefore a festival for a deity who was not honored for the benefits he brought, but rather propitiated and pacified for the destruction he wrought or could wreak if he so chose. Robigus, the god of rust and mould. He was a deity who blighted the crops. The rust he caused was what we call wheat rust, and what we now know to be a fungal disease, and indeed it looks like the plant is rusting and corroding away. This dreaded rust colour was a sign Robigus was descending on the crops. The role he played in the Roman world thus reflects a practical and deeply anxious relationship with nature. Unlike the gods of sustenance, who we have visited in previous episodes, deities who symbolized bounty, fertility, growth, and prosperity, Robigus falls within our cluster of deities representing dissolution, corruption, and decay. Robigus, as a god, stood as a reminder of vulnerability, an ever-looming rust-coloured shadow who plagued the fields and haunted peace of mind with all the fragility of agricultural life and the constant threat of failure. Flora, the goddess of flowers in the last episode, opened the way for him. If you remember, when Flora didn't receive her due worship and attention, she punished the people by simply retreating. Conceptually, Robigus and Flora therefore went together. When the agricultural writer Varro describes the gods he thinks most vital to the health and the prosperity of Rome, he forgoes a lot of the all-star divine cast and names the ones fundamental to the health of the crops. Fourth in his list are Robigus and Flora. For when they are propitious, he says, the rust will not harm the grain and the trees, and they will not fail to bloom in their season. Wherefore, in honour of Robigus has been established the solemn feast of the Robigalia, and in honour of Flora, the games called the Floralia. Although very different deities, there's a logic to the way these two complement each other. Flora never actively harmed the crops and the flowers and fields and gardens, but neglected, and without her beneficent presence to protect them, the plants were exposed to all the destructive powers of the elements, blights and plagues. Of all such concerns, Robigus, we learn, was chief among them. The ancient natural historian Pliny the Elder speaks at length of all the things that could go wrong with the crops. Wind is injurious to wheat and barley at 3 seasons, he explains. When they're in flower, or directly after they've shed their flower, or when they are beginning to ripen. At the last stage, it shrivels up the grain, while in the preceding cases, its influence is to prohibit the seed from forming. Successive gleams of sun appearing out of cloud are also injurious. Also, maggots breed in the root when, after rains following seed time, a sudden spell of heat has enclosed the moisture in the ground. They also grow in the grain when heat following rain causes the ear to ferment. There's also a small beetle called the cantharus which gnaws away corn crops. He goes on and on. It's no surprise that the health of the crops and the things that attacked them were known extensively, and in the minutiae, the stomachs of the populace demanded this kind of attention and depended on it. So Pliny goes on listing all manner of disease and pestilence. However, one of the most harmful climatic maladies of corn crops and vines, he states, is rust. So Robigus takes pride of place, if pride indeed there is to be had in doing harm, for being one of the farmer's worst fears, and by extension the rumble and hungry bellies around Rome. In this episode, we'll explore his world of rust and mould. So let us walk among the fields of wheat and corn, where the green stalks brittle and the limp leaves ochre. Let us leave the good graces of Flora and enter the realm of Robigus. This is one of my favourite objects in Rome's Palazzo Massimo museum. It may not look like much at first glimpse. It's not as dazzling and alluring to the eye as many of the museum's other treasures, but for an ancient historian, it's a treasure trove of information. It's what remains of an ancient calendar called the Fasti Praenestini. Fasti simply means calendar, and Praenestini comes from the name of the town where it was found, Praeneste, which is near Rome. Pleasingly, we have mentions of this exact calendar in the ancient sources, and so we know it was hung in the forum for public viewing in a hemicircular structure. We can imagine all the ancient people consulting it, peering over each other's shoulders, pointing, checking the days and details of so many of the festivals that we've mentioned in this series. It's fragmentary, obviously, and much is missing, but we glean much from what remains. This fragment is of particular interest to us here because the large letters R-O-B, which you may be able to discern, refer to Robigus and his festival of the Robigalia. This offers then clear archaeological evidence for the cult of Robigus, and it offers epigraphic testimony to some of the details we learn from our literary sources. The calendar confirms the date as the 25th of April, for example, and notes, no business, public holiday, Robigalia. It announces a festival held on the Via Claudii, the Claudian Way, ad miliarium quinque, that's at the 5th milestone, with the clearly stated purpose, ne robigo frumentis noceat. That means, lest rust harm the grain. And this confirms that the fundamental purpose of the festival was as ritual action undertaken to ward off Robigus. Clearly then, just as we'd already gathered, he's not a benevolent deity, but I don't know that it's right to call him malevolent either, though I have sometimes read this from modern commentators. I'm not convinced that this was the ancient attitude, though, or that he actually came in a cruel and punishing manner. He was feared, but I don't know that he was viewed as being hell-bent on destruction and devastation. Rather, I think it's possible that this was simply his nature, as the quiet undoing, the pestilential breath that curls through the ripening wheat, his touch of red rust spreading across the grain, with the leaves and stalks withering wherever he goes. So he certainly does harm, but I don't know that he does it in malice or retaliation. In his footsteps, a weltering fever follows him through the harvest. And so dealing with this undesirable presence wasn't really a case of asking for anything other than that he stay far away. It doesn't seem like he has anything to offer except his absence. And in this way, his cult and worship can be seen as apotropaic, something that we thought a lot about in episode 9 when we looked at Nvidia, if you were with us then. Apotropaic objects and behaviour are meant to ward off evil and bad luck, as we saw was the case with the evil eye. However, the religious attentions of the Robigalia also seem to fall under that rubric, as the entire festival is geared towards pacifying the god and staving him off. And I've been saying he and him all along because the weight of evidence leans towards a male deity called Robigus, but the name does occur in a few prominent places as a female goddess, Robigo. And nobody knows what to make of that, really. But I think since this wasn't a deity that was praised and celebrated, and since there weren't depictions of the deity that we know of, either in sacred spaces or adorning homes in frescoes and mosaics, I think perhaps the numen of this god retained its ambiguous, nebulous form as the spirit of wheat rust, rather than any overly specific, let alone human, form. As something you tried to ward off, it makes sense that you don't bring it too clearly into being, whether in art or in the mind's eye. Though that's only my speculation. But in any case, it seems that some people thought of a male Robigus and others occasionally a female Robigo. And I present him to you as male because, as I say, some hefty ancient authorities refer to him that way. And also, for formative years of my life, I didn't know that there even was an alternative, and I thought of him solely as a male deity. Now, the calendar ends with an accompanying note. Sacrificium et ludi cursoribus majoribus minoribus viunt, which records terse details about what actually happened at the festival, namely a dual observance of sacrifice and races for both youths and adults. So, although laconic, this marble fragment is wonderful, tangible evidence for the festival of Robigus. We already knew that it existed, but this fragment, like a satisfying jigsaw puzzle piece, corroborates in the real world, in the material evidence, what various literary authors put in writing. But to flesh it out in some more detail and to get a sense of the deity and the day, we can join the poet Ovid as he wanders along the road on his way back to Rome and stumbles into the Robigalia in full swing. The writings of Ovid is one of those prominent places I mentioned where the deity is female, not male, so here we will encounter Robigo. On that day, Ovid writes, meaning the 25th of April, as I was returning from Nomentum to Rome, a white-robed crowd blocked the middle of the road. A flamen, that is a priest, was on his way to the grove of ancient Robigo. So we learned that participants wore white for these rites, and that there was a flamen, a priest officially involved. We know from other sources that this was in fact a flamen Quirinalus, or a priest of Quirinus. And Quirinus was a very important deity to Roman identity because he was the deification of the city's first king, Romulus. Quirinus was a very old Roman deity, so if the flamen Quirinalus were involved in the rituals to Robigus, it lends a certain gravity to the proceedings and reveals the importance of Robigus in the official recognition of what he personified. We learn that the reason for the festival taking place out here by the 5th milestone is that there was a sacred grove to the deity out here. Traditionally, the Robigalia was believed to have been established by Rome's pious second king, King Numa, which makes some sense if his predecessors first had to become a god in order for a priest in the service of his godhood to conduct the rites. But clearly people turned up in great numbers as they were blocking the road like any good festival goers as they were headed out to the sacred grove. Now, Ovid tells us some pretty upsetting details about what the priest was up to and what the rites to Robigus entailed. He was on his way out to the grove of Robigus, or Robigo, to throw the entrails of a dog and the entrails of a sheep into the flames. Straight away, Ovid says, I went up to him to inform myself of the rite. Animal sacrifice is always horrible, but since you hear about it so much in the ancient world, you tend to stop thinking about the reality of all those bulls and sheep and pigs and goats. But when you hear about the sacrifice of dogs, the sad and dreadful reality rushes all too vividly to mind. And this is made worse, I suppose, by the fact that we remain accustomed to the slaughter of those other animals as they remain farm animals today, whereas dogs are entirely outside of that context, and they are, for many of us, our best friends. That's certainly the case for me. So we won't dwell on it, but it should be said that it was an unusual sacrifice for Romans too, so much so that Ovid asks the priest why a dog is sacrificed for this festival. You ask why an unusual victim is assigned to these rites. Learn the cause, the priest said to Ovid. There is a dog, they call it the Icarian dog, and when that constellation rises, the earth is parched and dry, and the crop ripens too soon. This dog is put on the altar instead of the starry dog, and the only reason why this happens is his name. According to the priest then, or at least Ovid's telling of what the priest said, the poor dogs are just a proxy for a canine constellation. This is the dog star, Sirius, known as the heat-bringing hound. The rising of this constellation together with the sun was believed to bring on the scorching heat and swelter of midsummer. This type of sacrifice was therefore determined just because the ill-omened cluster of stars was named after a dog, and what was wished upon those withering stars was enacted instead upon the poor doggos. And there may have been more to it than this. We also learn that the dogs that were sacrificed were specifically rust-coloured ones. And there seems to be a thematic of red running through the aesthetic logic of the ceremony, and maybe some sort of sympathetic magic at work. We hear some incidental details about the priest in addition. From his right hand dangled a loosened cloth, whatever that was for, and perhaps it's better we don't know. And he had a bowl of wine and a casket of incense. The incense and wine and sheep guts and the foul entrails of a filthy dog he put upon the altar. Ovid doesn't mention it, but what the calendar additionally told us was that races for adults and youths accompanied the sacrifice, and that sounds a lot jollier. Logistically, there may have been two different events happening in different places, or they may have been held in the sacred grove if it were big enough, or else maybe the participants had to move on to another location after all the gloomy undertakings to run about and feel better about the day, which may explain why Ovid doesn't mention the races as he carried on his journey. What he does preserve for us marvellously, though, is the words the priest supposedly said to Robigus. So here are the words of an ancient prayer to the deity of rust and mould. Thou scaly Robigo, spare the sprouting corn, and let the smooth top quiver on the surface of the ground. Oh, let the crops nursed by the stars of a propitious sky grow till they are ripe for the sickle. No feeble power is thine. The corn on which thou hast set thy mark, the sad farmer gives up for lost. Nor winds, nor showers, nor glistening frost that nip the sallow corn harm it so much as when the sun warms the wet stalks. Then, dread goddess, is the hour to wreak thy wrath. scaly Robigo here descending in wrath as a fearsome character. The comparison with the other things that harm the crops is interesting, though. Frost and wind and rain. This echoes what Pliny was saying earlier, that of all the terrible things that could befall your harvest, this rusting disease was worst of all. And he gives the conditions that seem favourable to an outbreak: wet stalks warming in the sunshine. That seems no poetic flourish, but some true agrarian know-how. These damp, humid, warm conditions are similar to what Pliny also seems to be describing as those favoured by Robigus. Rust, he says, is most frequent in a district exposed to dew and in shut-in valleys that have no current of air through them, whereas windy places and high ground, on the contrary, are free from it. Good circulation, in other words, sounds like it would air out the environment and so prevent the kind of clamminess that invited Robigus in. This was, of course, precisely the invitation all these efforts at the Robigalia sought to avoid making. And so before reading you the rest of the prayer to Robigus, I want to show you a short piece about another deity who is his exact opposite. Ceres, goddess of the grain and harvest, whose favour is courted and warmth, light and shared joy. These two deities embody opposing forces in the agricultural, religious cosmos, and to observe how she was entreated is to shore up everything that is equal and opposite about Robigus. As goddess of the fruitful earth, Ceres stands at the heart of cultivation and abundance, governing the natural rhythms of the fields and their unfolding from seed to harvest. Her realm is the promise of plenty, the blessing bestowed upon the grain in return for careful tending and reverent celebration. To her, the farmer turns with gratitude and hope. Listen to what Virgil says about worshipping her. Above all, worship thou the gods, and bring great Ceres her yearly offerings, doing sacrifice on the springing grass, close to the verge of dying winter, when now spring skies are clear, then lambs are fat, and then wine's mellowest, then sleep is sweet, where the shade thickens on the hill. To Ceres let all thy rustic folk do service. To her be sure to wash the honeycomb with milk and soft wine, and for luck let the victim thrice encircle the springing crops, and all the band of thy fellows keep joyful company, and loudly call Ceres into the homestead. Neither let anyone lay sickle to the ripe ears, till in Ceres' praise, his brows wreathed with twisted oak, he move in hearty dances and chant her hymn. Notice that this homage to Ceres is an invitation, an open door into the heart of the homestead and the community's life. Her rites are vibrant and joyous, her presence welcomed among the rustic folk with dance and song and offerings. Ceres is called warmly into the field, into people's very households, and is celebrated in close communion with the earth and the people who tend it. Robigus, by stark contrast, is alienated as a power of destruction and decay, who is held in check only by propitiation, ritual acts meant to divert his attention. Prayer to him is not one of invitation, but quite the contrary. A plea, as we've seen, to spare the harvest, and a deterrent, entreating him to go away and stay away. So as we leave behind the blistering world of rust and the sorry howling at the heart of it, as the episode draws to a close and our poet companion Ovid wends his way along the Via Claudia back to Rome, here's the rest of the prayer he recorded, uttered by that priest he met out at the 5th milestone. It takes an interesting turn because it attempts to turn the corrosion away from the fields and upon somewhere it would be more useful and desirable, onto metal weapons and arms. And this is a glimpse, finally, that the rust on the crops and the rust on metals are thought of in the same breath and in the same way, with Robigus equally capable of rusting metal as grain. In this prayer, attempts are made to avert his red ruin and do some uncharacteristic good with his corrosive powers, and meanwhile to let the gardening tools shine. O spare, I pray, and take thy scabby hands from off the harvest. Harm not the tilled soil. 'Tis enough that thou hast the power to harm. Grip not the tender crops, but rather grip the hard iron. Forestall the destroyer. Better that thou should gnaw at swords and baneful weapons. There is no need for them, the world is at peace. Now let the rustic tools, the rakes and the hard hoe and the curved share be polished bright, but let rust defile the arms and weapons, and when one attempts to draw the sword from the scabbard, let him feel it stick from long disuse. But do not thou profane the corn, and ever may the farmer be able to pay his vows to thee in thine absence. In this way, Robigus tells us something important about Roman religion. Worship wasn't always a case of admiration, nor was this the pragmatism or ritualistic approach to religion that Romans are often slightly accusingly described as maintaining. What I think we see, rather, are all the processes of life and all the forces people had to contend with, for better or for worse, animated by the divine, and therefore respected and consciously attended to. So deities didn't fall into black and white characters like good and evil, nor were they necessarily driven by anything other than their own inherent nature. These gods were forces that people simply had to live with. Some, hopefully, as in Robigus's case, at far remove, but this is a worldview that encompassed and dealt with all facets of life, including those that caused anxiety and other negative emotions. And while sacrificing dogs was not the most effective way to deal with fungal crop infestations, this ritual and others like it did provide a mental space, communal space in the sacred groves, as well as a space in the social calendar for people to come together, acknowledge the things they feared, and together to do their best in their own way to confront it.